And if I'm exhausted and just trying to like go fast and manage all these agents and review all this code that I didn't write or nobody else even wrote, an agent wrote, I'm less likely to have those creative insights, right? And to innovate.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to HangarDX podcast. This is a podcast about developer experience and how engineering teams solve productivity challenges at scale. I'm your host, Ankit, co-founder of Aviator. At Aviator, we are building AI coding verification platform to help keep your AI in check. Today, my guest is Margaret. We've been trying to get Margaret for such a long time. I'm very excited finally we have her here. I have read a lot about Margaret, so I'm very excited to kind of like go into this conversation. So, if folks don't know, she also created or helped create the space framework and has been involved in developer experience industry for a long time. Probably one of the most experienced person in this space. So, Margaret, thank you so much for making time. Very excited to have you here. Can you please introduce yourself more formally for our audience, and we'll get going.
Great. Thank you so much, Ankit. And thank you so much for inviting me today to your podcast. I'm really excited to be here and to chat with you about some of the things that I've been up to. I think you did a pretty good job of introducing me. As you mentioned, I'm a professor at the University of Victoria, so I'm an academic, but I kind of straddle a bit between academia and industry. So I work a lot with companies, trying to understand developer experience, trying to understand the tools that they use, the engineering systems, and trying to basically come with ways to make their life better. I used to be a tool builder some years ago and was building tools for developers. And then I switched more to trying to observe and try to understand their needs, their lived experiences. And I actually started studying developer satisfaction and developer productivity. Productivity is such a loaded word, but I started studying that probably back in 2017. And many of the research studies that I did over those years contributed to space, which you know about. And it was a pretty exciting kind of way of framing productivity and shaking up that it isn't just one thing. It's a complicated space to be in. I'll leave it at that for now.
Amazing. So the main topic for this conversation is going to be your article that you wrote. But before
Sure.
we get into that, let's briefly at least talk about space. So we don't get you every day, so I want to at least like make
Okay.
sure we can cover that too. So when you started your space research, we already had like a little bit more formalized DORA as a framework for
Sure.
productivity, which is well known. Um, how did you think about kind of like, okay, maybe there's a different framework that we need to go about, and what were sort of like things that you wanted to do differently compared to the DORA framework?
Yeah, I mean, DORA was and still is, right, a very successful framework for measuring delivery of features. And space is really taking a step back from that and looking at a more holistic view of developer productivity and experience and trying to understand the space of things. I mean, I'll use the word space since we did too, and that's why it fits. But basically, the space of dimensions that affects developer productivity. And the acronym, probably a lot of your listeners know about it, but maybe do you want me to just quickly go over
Yeah,
that?
let's do it.
And so S is for satisfaction. So as I mentioned, a lot of the research that I did in 2017 was about trying to understand what factors make or help developers feel satisfied and feel that the work is having impact. So that research actually showed us that if developers don't feel as satisfied, they're not as likely to feel or be as productive, and vice versa. So if you are productive in your work, you are also more satisfied with your work. So that was the S. The P is about really focusing on the outcomes or the performance or the quality of the work that you're doing, which of course is really what we're trying to measure. If you're thinking about a company, it's like you can be measuring lots of activities or lots of features being shipped, but is that actually leading to performance or outcomes, at the company or at the end user level? And then A is the one that probably kind of spurred a lot of my research. I remember sitting in a talk years before we developed space. I'm not going to say who or which company this was from, but I was sitting listening to a keynote and somebody said, oh, yes, we measure developer productivity by lines of code. And I'm like, oh my God, that's terrible. A, though, is activity, things like writing lines of code, number of PRs. They can be useful signals, but they don't necessarily do a good job of measuring developer productivity because development is not a factory, right? We're not trying to develop widgets. And then C is one that's really near and dear to my heart. It's about collaboration. So a lot of software development projects are a team sport. We're a team of developers trying to create some software. And so C looks at how in your work are you able to collaborate and coordinate with others? What kind of feedback are you getting from others? What amount of time are you spending helping others in their work? I could say more about this one if you wanted, but maybe we'll come back to it later. And then the E stands for efficiency and flow. And I wish flow started with an E because it really is more about that flow. You can think of E as packing a lot in. It is about the flow of the work, the efficiency of the work. But to me, it also represents the experience that developers have of that flow experience as they're being creative and as they're being innovative, which has a connection then, of course, to their satisfaction.
Amazing.
Can I
Yeah.
say one more thing
Yes,
about
let's
this?
please.
So a lot of people tend to think of the dimensions as being kind of not connected, being independent, but there is a dependency. So if you spend time trying to maybe improve the number of code reviews a developer does, that's going to have maybe an impact on how collaborative they are, but it might then also lead to less work done. So it might lead to lowering another activity metric and it may not make them feel as happy. So it's important to think about those dimensions together, right? Yeah. Anyway,
Amazing. So I do want to also have to double click on this now.
sorry.
So we talked about DORA. So DORA came out in what, like 2014, I think, somewhere
Yeah,
around.
yeah, yeah.
Felt like that was a little bit more objective. You can kind of more
Yes,
objectively measure, right?
absolutely.
If space sounds feels more subjective, right? Has so many different dimensions in itself,
Yes,
right?
yeah.
And I know sort of a lot of your research is also based on okay, developer surveys helps us get a lot
Mhm.
more subjective plus sort of at least also quantifiable data. Was it always intentional, sort of the fundamentals of this framework, that it's a little bit more subjective and sort of broader categories itself?
I think it's not, it can be used not only for subjective metrics, it can also be used for objective as well. So you can, using telemetry, look at the number of code reviews that are done, which you could look at. You could consider that as a collaborative metric. You could also look at, flow right through telemetry. But I think the reason that probably when it comes to mind and a lot of uses of the framework have been for surveys, for collecting more perception, like perceived of experience of developers, is because we developed space just after COVID. Kind of happened. Actually, it was during COVID. And I was involved with some researchers at Microsoft, and we were studying what happened when 43,000 developers overnight pivoted to working at home. And we were studying what is the impact of that on their productivity and on their, the quality of the work that they're doing and their well-being as well. And when you look just at telemetry data, you might have thought, oh my gosh, look, number of PRs are up, we're doing better, everything's fine, developers are doing fine at home. But then when we actually asked them through interviews and through surveys, we found a very, very different story. And even in that subjective data, we found some hints that, okay, we may be going fast today, but at some point we're going to hit a wall. And at some point we're going to lose track of who knows what and who's doing what. Collaboration was one of those big things that came out of that study. And so you really do need both if you want to understand, developer experience and developer productivity, to kind of use signals maybe from the telemetry data, but also to be asking people to understand, what's going on. So telemetry data will tell you what is happening, but talking and listening and observing developers really tells you why that's happening. And it also maybe tells you what are the things that are not happening that should be.
Interesting. So we always in software engineering talk about having single data source, single source of truth in some ways to have consistency. What happens if these two, your telemetry and your surveys are saying opposite things? Who do you trust more?
Well, you don't trust either without looking at both in tandem. I mean, that's always, as a researcher, that's always kind of nice when we see kind of discrepant information like that. I think it's important that you realize, okay, there's something we don't understand. Either maybe the telemetry data that we're gathering. I mean, every time you have a metric, it's always a proxy for something else, and maybe it's a poor proxy, it's a poor way of operationalizing the thing that we're trying to understand. So maybe we're trying to, maybe we use a metric, and I don't think this is a good metric for understanding collaboration, but maybe we use, number of meetings or number of peer reviews as a collaboration, as an objective metric.
Mm,
Those are not giving you the full picture. They're not telling you about the time a junior started and the junior, didn't want to publicly ask a question in a channel. So we have no sort of trace of that. The junior goes to the person's office and knocks on their door and says, I really don't understand the code that I'm reviewing. Can you help me? And then the developer, stops, the senior stops and says, yes, come on, come in and I'll explain to you. So those are the kind of things that those telemetry metrics never really give you. Likewise, when you ask people, subjectively, what is your perceived productivity or how much time did you spend in meetings? Those are not complete either, right? We're relying on memory, we're relying on biases, we're relying on people saying the things that we might want them to say. But when we take those together, hopefully we get a better signal. And I think, the other piece that I want to add to this is that the industry is trying to sort of, create easy to measure things to be able to tell a picture of what's going on. And it's complicated. Like it's not easy. A survey only tells you so much. The telemetry only tells you so much. Sometimes you have to interview people or sit down and watch what they're doing, observing people, seeing what they're doing, experiencing, walking sort of a mile in their shoes. You're going to learn a lot more from doing that.
very cool. Yeah, I mean, this is actually something we talk about in our community quite a lot, which is like the data that you're collecting defines essentially what your understanding is. If your data itself is, you know, incorrect or limited, you're essentially missing a big picture
Yeah.
around what could be going wrong that you might not have.
Yeah. And that's always the case.
Right.
There's no
Right.
perfect survey and no perfect there'll always be missing pieces. Yeah.
Amazing. Okay, maybe last question on space before we move on.
Sure.
So, forward looking, I think, has changed a lot of some of these aspects. Like we used to talk about flow state, context switching, kind of like critical aspects of, what makes developers productive. I feel like now almost everyone is like multitasking, working on 20 different tasks, passing things to agents, and a lot of even your collaboration aspects of the framework possibly are getting changed or disrupted in some ways. What are your thoughts? Like, kind of like, do we need a different framework for this? I know some of the basics should still apply, but what things matter more? Has anything changed with the advancements in AI?
Yeah. I mean, I think everything has changed. All aspects of our work. I think space still kind of stands up pretty well because the dimensions are quite broad. But I think the questions that we ask within each of those dimensions and the things that we look for and the ways that we look for them have shifted a lot. Um, Maybe I'll talk about collaboration and flow a little bit. With collaboration, we still don't have a lot of insights on how really, um, you know, interacting with agents is having on how people collaborate. We know that, I talked about that code review example of the junior developer knocking on somebody's door. That was actually an ethnography study that we did, an ethnographic study where we followed people around and watched what they did outside the
Amazing.
channels. I think that now with, tools like, Claude or ChatGPT, any of these AI tools that they're using, the juniors are more likely going to be using, these tools to ask the questions first, explain the code to me. And that's not new either. I remember, so I'm a bit older than you. You maybe, don't remember when Stack Overflow, showed on the scene, but I remember when Stack Overflow showed up and talking to some of my students. And, I was saying to them, what kind of support do you get when you go intern in companies? And one of the students said, oh, I was told not to interrupt anybody on the team until I had searched Stack Overflow for the answer to a question before I interrupted the team. And I was like, whoa. And so it's not brand new, right? The fact that there are these resources out there that you can turn to instead of talking to humans,
Hmm.
are talking to each other. But I think now tools like, Claude and Cursor, they give better answers. And so the juniors are maybe trusting the answers that they're getting from these tools and then not going to the seniors. And that impacts a lot because the relationships aren't built up as well, I think, as well as the seniors now don't know what it was that the junior maybe was struggling with,
Right.
whereas before they would know. And of course, offloading each of the developers on a team now as they're engaging more and more with the agents that they're using. They're becoming almost like little managers, right, of the agents that they're working with. And they're now interacting with the other humans, perhaps more in a manager to manager kind of capacity rather than as a creator or a problem solver level. So there's a lot of shifts coming. And I don't think we know yet, what those are going to be. But definitely got to keep our eye on that and ask different kinds of questions about awareness and transactive memory and distributed cognition. How is our cognition across the team distributed now that we have agents, right? Do I even know what the other humans on my team know anymore? Do I need
Right.
to know? Because maybe I have an agent that can help me. There's a lot of questions
Right.
there.
Right. Which
And
actually,
then,
like,
yeah,
sorry,
sorry,
go
go
ahead.
ahead.
No, no, go ahead. Finish your thought.
And then just with flow, where I've been doing a study. We have a paper with some colleagues. I can give you a link to that if you want. Call it Good Vibrations, kind of early insights on how vibe coding influences flow. And
Okay.
we see a lot of impacts from how AI is impacting experience of flow. So I
Very
can share
interesting.
that paper with you as well if you
Yeah,
like.
absolutely. I mean, we would love to also add this to show notes so people can find it. So this actually brings us to the topic of the discussion.
Yes,
Wanted to talk about the article or the research that you published about the technical debt to cognitive and intent debt.
yes,
I feel like I've at least heard of cognitive debt before. I've never heard of intent debt. So
yes.
at least for the audience, maybe you can explain a little bit about both of these debt. How are they different from technical debt? We can just start from definition.
Yeah. So I actually started using the term cognitive debt last October. Before we started recording, I was telling you I was teaching an entrepreneur startup course at the university with business students and computer science students. And I teach it every year. And this year I was really sort of trying to encourage them to use AI to go faster. And I knew that that was a risk, that they could perhaps lose control a little bit of the code that they were writing and of the architecture that they were building. But as you know, in an entrepreneur situation, you want to go fast, right? You want to get something into the hands of users and figure out, am I building the right thing, right? And the fastest way to do that is to have a prototype. And that worked really well. They were building things really fast, really putting it into the hands of their users in a way that I'd never seen before. Um, but then I realized that I was hearing things from the teams that, oh, one of the students wanted this change, and the other student said, oh, we can't do that. We can't make that change.
Right.
I'm like, what? Of course you can make that change. Why can't you make that change? And then at first I thought, okay, they have technical debt, right? They have messy code. Kent, you mentioned Kent Beck at the beginning. Kent Beck talks a lot about technical debt limits optionality. Actually, he came in and he gave a chat to my students, which was really lovely. And he
Amazing.
talked about this. And so I thought, okay, they have technical debt. And then, so I started talking to them and meeting with them, and I realized it's not about technical debt. It's about the fact that they have kind of lost the plot in the team. They have lost track of, what features they're really trying to build and why. They didn't articulate those as well as I thought. And they didn't even really know who knew what in the team.
Interesting.
Or worse, on one of the teams, it was one person who knew all of the code and understood the code because they were driving, they were supervising the AI that generated the code, and the rest of them were not able to do that. And the person who had generated the code didn't really understand what was generated. And so when a change was requested, they were no, I can't really make that change. Every time I try to change something, something else breaks in the system. And so that's when I came up actually with a canvas, a worksheet for my students for each of the groups to work through and to say, okay, where are you on this prototype to product journey? And how much technical debt do you have and how much cognitive debt? So I define cognitive debt as being that kind of understanding of what the system is doing and why and who knows what across the team. And then had them kind of evaluate how much cognitive debt they had, how much technical debt they had, and what they were going to do about it. So
Very
that's
interesting.
cognitive debt.
Okay.
That understanding that's distributed across the team. It also builds on some prior research that Peter Nauer did many years ago. I don't know if you've heard of Bacchus-Nauer form, but that Peter Nauer. And he wrote a paper many years ago that software isn't about the code, it's about the theory that's in developers' heads. So the code is less important. It's the theory of what we all together in the team have in our heads that is really the valuable asset. And that knowledge is about, how we map from the world to the code, how the system is designed, what the architecture looks like, and what is the capacity for change. And so that's kind of that captures a little bit the kinds of knowledge that needs to be distributed across the team in a way that they can then make change in the future.
Very interesting. So
I hope that was a crisp enough definition.
so you're saying this is the intent debt. So intent debt is
This is more the cognitive debt, what is in the minds of the developers.
okay.
Or we can go future into agents being team members later on. But
Yes,
for
I
now,
do want to come onto that, but yes, I would love to
yeah.
at least also have you describe what intent debt is and how is that different?
Okay, let's talk about intent debt. So intent debt was something I also realized back in October
Mhm.
that the students, because they were moving so fast with writing code and being able to deploy their software apps really, really fast, they were losing track a little bit of what it was, how the features they were building related to the user needs. So basically, what they were building was drifting from what they were intending to build at the beginning.
Interesting.
Yeah. So
Okay.
intent debt is the why are we doing this? Whose problem are we trying to solve? And what is the important information? What are the constraints that we need to know about? And what is it also that we're not building?
Very interesting. So I have a lot of questions. So let's kind of
Yes.
maybe jump in a few things here and there. So
Yes.
let's start with cognitive debt.
Yes.
So you mentioned cognitive debt is about how well do you understand the system? That's at least a very lame version of describing it in some ways.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or in some ways also limitations of what your system can and cannot,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
How does that relate with? We were just also talking about how now even recent grads or new hires when onboarding can they directly ask questions to Claude or whatever coding agent that they're using, Codex. So why is cognitive debt more? In some ways, it should be less because now you can ask questions to the agents and get answers. So in
Yeah.
some ways, you can kind of have this sort of system which becomes your memory, and you don't need to keep everything in your head. So why is it getting worse versus in some ways maybe even getting better?
So that's a really, really good question. And I talk about that a little bit in the paper that AI is providing a solution to solving some of that.
Uh-huh.
So it's a great way of explaining how some of the code works. It's a great way of, sharing that knowledge across the team. You could even imagine having an agent that is keeping track of who knows what and who's an expert in any particular system. So I'm sure you know yourself that when you work in a team, you don't want everybody understanding all of it, right? You want that knowledge distributed. The problem lies with cognitive debt if you don't know to ask those questions, right? If you don't have awareness in your team, who knows what, who's kind of the go-to, right? When we need to understand a particular part of the system. Do I know what you know? Do you know what I don't know? That's where, cognitive debt kind of accrues over time. And it's not so much a property. I don't use it in the way of describing, my cognitive debt if I'm part of the team. It's more kind of a property of the system, right? A property of the project. And this is what I saw with my teams. And it's what I'm also hearing a lot from practitioners after I posted a couple of things about this. They're saying, I heard one person even today say, that sometimes it scares him that he creates this system and it works and it's running and he's forgotten what it is that he was even trying to create in the first place. So it's that kind of that loss of control, that loss of memory across the system about what even questions to ask anymore. But you're
Interesting.
absolutely correct that AI is showing ways at helping repair cognitive debt, but we shouldn't just assume that that's going to, solve the issues, right?
Right.
You can't automate understanding, but you can use automation to help you repair your lack of understanding.
Very interesting. So in
Yeah.
some ways you're saying is there are probably more blind spots now just because
Yes.
one, intensity has increased, but two, also you're not as deeply working on looking at the code as you were before.
Yes. Yeah.
right?
Actually, I think blind spot is a really good term. I'll pick up with that. So, I mean, when you know that you have a blind spot, you check it, right? When you're in the car, but it's the blind spots that you don't know about that you don't check, right? And that, so that happens, with the system. If you don't know that there are dependencies, maybe hidden dependencies or hidden security flaw, you're not checking for those, right? And so that's kind of where cognitive debt can become a problem, right? When there's that lack of awareness over time.
Yeah, very interesting. Because I think in some ways, this is something I also kind of like talk a lot about, which is one of the most important aspects of an organization, which has like been in the industry for a few years, is all the decisions that the organization has made up until
Yes,
this point. I feel like coding systems generally can look at like, okay, what is the state today? They don't
yes,
understand the assumptions, they don't understand the decisions that led to the place where we are today.
absolutely. And that's where we get into intent debt a little bit. So the agent can explain to you, if depending on what it has access to, right?
Hmm.
But it can explain to you how the system is running today. But if somebody didn't write down or share with the agent why we're doing things the way we're doing it, why we're building the architecture this way, why we're using certain technologies, why we're not implementing this feature, why we're implementing certain features in this way and not in that way, then that information becomes harder, right, to share across the team and to use as you go forward. And I know that your tool, for example, you build specifications, right? But even when you make that step from identifying what the user needs are to creating the specifications, you can sometimes lose something, right, in that
Hmm.
translation. And then you can then further lose something when you go from specification to the code or specification to tests. You can lose something. And then all the way through to the end, the metrics that you measure, sometimes they don't go all the way back to the user needs. They may just actually measure the specifications. And so that's where intent debt, unless you're cautious, can build up.
Interesting. Have you thought about like some framework or some way for organizations to understand and measure sort of like their cognitive debt?
I knew you were going to ask that question. So the answer is I'm working on it. um, I think that what I'm worried about a little bit is that organizations and teams will rush to creating metrics. So we have a tendency in software engineering. I mean, we are engineers. We like crisp metrics. We like to believe that those metrics represent the things that we care about and we have control. And so I think, being a little careful at developing, I won't even say the word measures, but signals of when we have cognitive debt and when we have intent debt is more important at the beginning than trying to say, let's find a number.
Hmm.
If you had an internal Stack Overflow, for example, or an internal forum, or you're tracking how often engineers ask questions to each other or to agents, maybe you could say, oh, that's a good measure of the lack of understanding. But we know that's incomplete, right? We know that it may be that people don't understand at all, and so they're not asking questions at all, right?
Right.
And it could make it look like it's things are okay, but they're not okay. So I think what I'm trying to do right now is listen a lot to practitioners. I'm trying to look a lot at the different tools and solutions that are being built to address these problems because we see that coming. Your tool is one of those. There are others that maybe come at it a little bit differently. And what is it exactly? What is the problem, right, that those tools are trying to address? And then what is the best way to maybe come at, let's call them signals, diagnostic signals of having problems with uh, cognitive debt and intent debt. And, I think what I'd like to push more is, and that's what I'm going to be doing with my team, is having the team sit down in their retrospectives. So, do you use retrospectives in your
Mhm.
team?
Yep.
What kinds of things do you talk about in your retrospectives?
So we actually do weeklies
Yeah.
because things are moving fast in the software engineering world. Mostly we talk about what things went well in this week, what things did not go well in this week, what can we start doing, and what should we stop doing. So kind of like we try to keep it broad, and
Yeah.
then based on the answers from everyone, we try to kind of
Right, right. So I think that those are really good questions. One of the things that I've been recommending is maybe ask more pointed questions. Like, let's throw up an architecture. Who knows how this overall architecture works. Whose name can we put beside the different subsystems or components? Who's the person who kind of really grasps that? Um, how do we map our features to our user needs? Are we doing a good job of that? If we look at our different, I don't know if you use personas, but if we look at those, are we really, evaluating whether our features are addressing those user needs? And when is the last time that we checked whether our features are mapping to the user needs today? So one of the things that we know, and we all know this, when we adopt software, it changes us, right? When we start using a software package, we start to our needs shift, our expectations of the software shift. And so maybe a question to ask is, how well are we keeping track of, is our product actually meeting our user needs as they are evolving from using
Interesting.
our product or just from the world changing around them?
Interesting. I feel like, okay, I've been in software engineering now for almost 20 years
Yeah,
as
you look
well. Like,
too
I'm
young.
old. I feel like
I meant that as
these
a
things,
compliment, by the way.
I appreciate it. I think these things existed all the time, to some degree. I
Yes.
think
Yes.
so. One is, I think this is going a little bit to intent debt. So let's
Yeah.
continue on
Yeah.
this track. I feel like this is interesting. Um, I noticed, so I've been, for the last 20 years, I've been in software industry, engineering industry. The first 10-ish years, I was mostly working in big companies, and then I transitioned to startups. The last decade, I've been mostly working
Nice.
in startups. I noticed the difference in large companies is generally, as software engineers, you essentially have several layers between you and the customers.
Yeah.
Versus in smaller companies and startups, generally you don't.
Yeah.
So I've noticed sort of like, understanding of that intent and being closer to the customer is lesser in larger companies just by
Yeah.
organization design.
Yeah.
Um, why are things different now? I understand, like, I'm just trying to understand what is, like, sounds like this is possibly an implication of AI, but I still don't know why and how it is
Yeah.
correlated to that.
Great question. These are not new things. They're not new things, right? I mean, we've always had challenges with comprehension, right? Program comprehension and team cognition across the team in development. We've had studies, we've had papers that have looked at this, and we've had, agile, right? Was one of the practices that came out to try to repair that understanding across the team, but also to repair, lack of understanding of the user needs, right? Um, and they've been around a long time. Intent to losing track, losing our way, building the wrong software system. That's been around a long time. If it hadn't been, we wouldn't have all the companies that kind of, failed and lost their way along the path. I think what's different now though is that AI is an amplifier. And it's amplifying the problems from poor understanding across your team. And it's amplifying because you're going so fast, it's easy to kind of lose track, right, of what it is that your users need. Um, so I'm a sailor. Let me give an analogy. Um, and I like to sail and I like to go fast. And I think of my boat as being similar to technical debt, or technology, right? The boat is the technology. And if I don't repair things on my boat, I can't, change courses quickly. I can't tack the sails as quickly. So I limit my optionality, right? By not doing maintenance on my boat. And then the intent debt part is, where am I going? What's my destination? And sometimes when you're going really fast and you've tuned everything really well on your boat, you forget about where you're going and you get in the thrill of the moment of going fast and you're optimizing your journey, but you're forgetting to keep an eye on, oh, wait a minute, there's a really bad weather system coming in over here. I really should change course and go to this other destination. My destination shifts. Or maybe I just drifted off course. Like maybe I'm going super fast and I just, nudged my compass bearing a little bit. Or maybe there were currents that were pushing me and I lose track of that. And so the faster that you're going on your boat, the more you're likely to drift off course. And the more you kind of get caught up in the optimizing of the journey. And I think AI, and this is, my opinion. I'm not, this isn't based on years of empirical research, but it is some of the signals that I'm seeing and hearing also from practitioners that this going fast is sort of causing this intent debt over time, this lack
Hmm.
of focus on where it is that we're supposed to be going and optimizing for the journey, right? Faster PRs, faster code review, tests, metrics that we put in place that we've lost track. What are they really measuring? Are they really measuring the right things? They look good, the dashboards look good, but are we really delivering the features that our users need?
Interesting. So I know kind of like even in our community, we have talked a few times about slow things down a little. Let's kind
Yes.
of like, do a little bit of even the retrospective part you were saying. Is there some way to kind of like, be more intentional about it? Are
Yes.
there kind of like, even if you're slowing down, what are we slowing down for? I mean,
Yes.
obviously, everyone is working like crazy. I mean, it's now very much proven that yes, AI has increased the intensity.
Yeah.
Maybe in future things will become easier for developers, but like today, I feel almost every developer is working harder than they
Yes.
were working before AI.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
if we are asking our teams to move slower, um, what are we asking in return? Like, what are we expecting things to happen? Like, how are we kind of like really, in some ways, practicing better
Yeah.
uh, software engineering through this?
Yeah. I mean, wow, there's a lot in that question. It's a great question, and I think you're thinking about this in exactly the right way. I think, and it goes back to that boat, that metaphor that I was using. Um, there's sort of this push towards removing friction, and we should, right? We should remove developer toil. We know we want to do that, and we kind of have this assumption that if we remove all of that friction, that we're going to be going faster in the right direction. But going fast is tiring. Going fast means that you're maybe just looking ahead and you're not looking side to side. And I think that, sometimes we need I was talking to Miles Russell and Keith Mann and Artie Starr today about, the brakes in the car are there to kind of protect you a little bit, that you can put the brakes on and realize I am losing control of this car. I'm
Hmm.
losing control of the journey. And I think in software development, kind of pausing, I think retrospectives are probably one of the most powerful things that you can use to do this, to say, how's everybody feeling? When I used to race on sailboats, and thinking about the well-being of the crew was really, really important. Did you rest well? Are you exhausted? Do you need a rest, from your position on the boat so that somebody else can take over and maybe do a better job? And when you look after the crew, right, you're also looking after the boat and you're looking after the race, right? You're going to do better.
Hmm.
And I think in software development, we don't do that enough. We don't think about the team. We don't think about how people are feeling. We don't realize that when we support developers and they're not, exhausted, which is what's happening with AI right now. We're hearing a lot about AI fry. Um, when we slow down, that's often when we do our most creative work. And, software development is not a factory where we're trying to like squeeze out every little bit of, capability out of the developers. Software development, and I was talking about that with the folks that I mentioned earlier today, that it's more about problem solving. That's what software is, right? I mean, that's what excites me about developing software, is that I think about a problem that a user has, and then I try to come up with the best solution. There's not just one solution. I try to come up with the best solution for them. And if I'm exhausted and just trying to like go fast and manage all these agents and review all this code that I didn't write or nobody else even wrote, an agent wrote, I'm less likely to have those creative insights, right? And to innovate. So I think some organizations are starting to realize that and starting to introduce intentional friction. Let's slow down. Brian Hauk talks about this in some of his research. Take some days off.
Hmm.
Go to the beach, go in nature. And that's when your best ideas come, is when you take time
Interesting.
off. Yeah.
Interesting. Maybe we should have a day in our software engineering every week where you're not allowed to use AI.
Yes. Gosh. Yes. Absolutely. And maybe play games. Maybe, do something, go for a walk in nature. Play a bunch of different games, and all of a sudden you'll see people on your team saying, "Oh, there's this thing in this game that I think could be a really cool feature in our product." right?
Right.
So you get great ideas when you move outside of the box, right?
Yes, absolutely. Okay, I have a lot of things to talk about, but I think we are unfortunately out of
Sorry,
time.
did
So
I
we'll
talk
have
too
to.
long?
No, this was amazing. I think we probably need to do another session to kind of like do a follow up on this. Margaret, this was more than what I expected. So thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. I know you're busy. You do a lot of different things. And thank you everyone who is listening. If you're interested in developer experience or work in DevOps, platform engineering, join us. Also, we do these conversations in our off the record sessions in HangarDX. You can find us on dx.community. And again, Margaret, thank you so much. This was a
Thank
lovely
you.
conversation.
Thank you. It was fun. Thank you.